It was the evening before the final closing of the major capital transaction between Apex Power and my investment firm, Mercer Capital. Representatives from both sides were present, including 15 key clients and 2 independent board observers. The ballroom was filled with the low murmur of high-stakes conversation. I sat quietly near the strategic discussion table in my cream-colored silk jacket, wearing my neutral guest badge. I had no desire to draw attention to myself. In my experience, the people who actually hold the power in these transactions do not need to make a scene. They simply watch and wait. But someone else in that room was very eager to make a scene, and she was heading directly toward my table with a coffee cup in her hand. The coffee hit my blouse in front of 15 clients, 2 board observers, and the people expecting me to release $2,400,000,000 the next morning. It spread in a hot, dark wave across ivory silk, and for one stupid second, my body wanted to do what humiliation always teaches people to do. Look down, apologize, make themselves smaller. I did not. No one moved. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the heat biting through the fabric, not the stain spreading over my chest, not even the smell of burnt roast rising between us. The silence. My name is Sarah Vance. I am 39 years old, and in rooms like that, silence tells you exactly who people think matters. A server froze beside the champagne station. One man near the window lowered his glass. Another looked down at his phone, refusing to witness it. In front of me, Catherine Thorne still held the empty coffee cup between 2 manicured fingers. Her expression was almost elegant. "Oh," she said softly, tilting her head. "How clumsy of me." It was not clumsy. I had seen the pause before she tipped the cup, the angle of her wrist, the careful half-step closer. She had taken one look at my neutral guest badge, my cream jacket, my quiet seat at the strategic table, and decided I was too ordinary to belong there. "I am so sorry," she added, in the tone women like her used when they wanted cruelty to sound polished. "Maybe someone can help you clean up in the service corridor. It is a better fit." My hand moved toward the napkin, then stopped. Reaching for the stain would have looked too much like surrender. "I am fine here," I said. Her smile thinned. "This section is reserved for principals." "I know." Her eyes hardened. "Then you also know that seat was not meant for you." A young event manager hurried over. Already pale, Catherine did not even look at him when she gestured toward me. "Please handle this." Across the room, I caught sight of Richard Thorne, the chief executive officer of Apex Power. He saw the stain on my blouse. He saw his wife trying to remove me from a room I had every right to be in. He did nothing. He adjusted his watch, turned back to a senior client, and pretended to be oblivious. Catherine looked me over and shrugged. "Call whoever you want," she whispered. I met her eyes, reached for my phone, and wondered if she knew who actually controlled the room she was attempting to clear. The event manager reached my table with the expression of a man walking toward a fire he had not started and could not afford to mirror. "Ma'am," he began carefully, glancing from the coffee on my blouse to Catherine's face. "Perhaps we can assist you to a private suite." Catherine cut in before he could finish. "This section is for strategic partners," she said, just loud enough for the nearest clients to hear. "Not support guests." The phrase landed exactly the way she wanted it to. Support guest. A label small enough to dismiss and embarrass in public. I remained seated. I did not blot the coffee. I did not explain myself. I did not offer my name. That unsettled the room more than anger would have. A woman near the floral display shifted awkwardly. The manager swallowed and tapped his tablet. His thumb paused over the screen. Catherine noticed. "There is no need to complicate this," she said, smiling without kindness. "Move her to the side lounge and have someone deal with the mess." Deal with the mess? As if the mess were me. Across the room, Richard Thorne saw exactly what was happening and still said nothing. He was about to learn that some mistakes cannot be polished away. The manager looked down again for half a second. His eyes widened. He had found my name in the system. I watched the moment recognition hit him, the small jolt in his face, the sudden caution. He parted his lips, probably to say it out loud, but Catherine stepped closer and rested her fingertips on the back of my chair. "Please," she said, the polish thinning now. "Let us not disrupt the real guests over a seating mistake." I could see the sweat starting to bead on the manager's forehead as he stared at the tablet. He knew the name Sarah Vance. and he knew that my signature was the only one that could authorize the bank transfer. Yet, Catherine was leaning over my chair, treating me like support staff that needed to be cleared away. I kept my hands folded in my lap, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the room press down on them until the tension became almost physical. The man seated across from me, Thomas Davies, lowered his wineglass to the table. The sound of the glass hitting the polished wood was sharp in the quiet room. He looked straight at Catherine and asked, "If she does not belong here, why is her name on our table?" The question did something the coffee had not. It made the room think. Catherine's smile stayed in place a second too long. The event manager looked from her to Thomas, then back to his tablet as if he wanted the screen to rescue him from the situation. "It may be a placement error," Catherine said smoothly, her voice tight. "These events get chaotic." Thomas did not nod. "Did they print the wrong place cards too?" The manager cleared his throat. "Her name is indeed listed here." "Yes," Thomas said softly, but not softly enough. Something shifted around the table. One client leaned forward to study my badge. Another frowned, searching his memory. Near the far end, a silver-haired woman murmured, "Vance," and then went still. Catherine recovered quickly, though her eyes were flashing with irritation. "That does not mean what you think it means," she said with a light laugh. "People are often added for support, overflow, coordination." I let her keep talking, and that was the first real turn. The less I said, the more everyone noticed how hard she was working to explain me away. Her desperation was becoming visible. A man on my right snapped his fingers. "Wait, I saw that name in the pre-read for tomorrow's closing session." The silver-haired woman turned toward him. "So did I." Catherine's jaw tightened. Richard Thorne finally crossed the room, adjusting his cuff as though he were arriving at a minor inconvenience instead of the scene his wife had created. "Is there a problem?" he asked, though his eyes flicked once to the stain on my blouse before moving away. "A small seating confusion," Catherine answered before anyone else could. "Nothing worth disrupting the evening." Richard gave me the kind of polished corporate smile meant to smooth over damage without admitting any had been done. "I am sure we can resolve this quietly without disrupting the evening," he said. Quietly. Not fairly, not honestly, quietly. The event manager still held the tablet in both hands now, as if it had become evidence in a trial. Catherine glanced at him with a warning hidden inside her smile. "We cannot let minor mistakes distract from our principal guests." At that exact moment, my phone vibrated against the tablecloth. I turned it over. The name on the screen was David Reynolds, my senior partner at Mercer Capital. I stood before anyone could suggest moving me. "Excuse me," I said, already reaching for my phone. Behind me, Catherine gave a soft, indulgent laugh. "Of course." I stepped away from the table, but not far, just enough to leave the circle without leaving the room. The reception still hummed around me. Low voices, polished shoes, expensive lighting, but I could feel eyes following the dark stain across my blouse. David picked up on the second ring. "Reynolds, David, it is Sarah." His tone changed immediately, losing its casual edge. "Go ahead." "Public conduct event in a closing environment," I said. 15 client witnesses, attempted removal from a strategic room, chief executive officer observed and did not intervene. Possible record softening already underway. David did not waste a word. "Is there documentation?" "Yes." "External witnesses?" "Yes." "Senior exposure?" "Yes." A pause, paper shifting on his end, then, "Understood. The investment agreement has strict covenants regarding reputation, leadership conduct, and governance standards." "Place an immediate legal hold on all records connected to tonight," I said. "Room logs, staff reports, camera pulls, internal messages, and incident notes. I want every bite preserved. They are already trying to frame this as a minor slip." "Done," David replied. "Do not leave the premises until we assess the leadership response." I was not planning on leaving anytime soon. His voice lowered. "Do you want the covenant reviewed tonight?" "Not yet." That was the line that mattered. If I moved too early, this became a personal reaction. If I waited, I would find out whether this had been one arrogant woman with a coffee cup or a company willing to protect her in real time. "Not yet," I said. "I want to see what leadership does first. Call me the moment they move." I ended the call. Catherine passed close enough to hear the last name. "Reynolds?" she repeated lightly. But some of the color had gone out of her face. How serious. I looked at her without smiling. That depends. For the first time that evening, she had no quick answer. Then she walked on, trying to rejoin the main crowd. I slipped my phone back into my hand and turned toward the reception. I was not going back in to defend my dignity. I was going back in to see how hard they would work to bury the truth. I watched Richard Thorne join his wife, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture of solidarity. He whispered something in her ear, and she smiled. They still thought they were the ones who decided who belonged in the room. But the trap was already set and they were walking right into it. By the time the reception ended, no one was calling it coffee anymore. That was how I knew it had become dangerous. Not because the room had forgotten, but because the room had started rewriting the facts. I stayed long enough to watch Richard shift from polished host to controlled damage manager. His smile never fully vanished, but it changed shape. It tightened, became functional. Near the far wall, he pulled two communications people aside and lowered his voice. "Social misunderstanding," he said. "That is the language we use." One of them nodded too quickly and typed it into her phone. Across the room, Catherine had cornered the event manager and a hospitality supervisor. She dabbed at her own wrist with a linen napkin as if she were the one who had been inconvenienced. "There was no intent," she said. "The note should reflect a spill during guest movement. Nothing else." They wanted to ensure that if any word leaked to the press or the board of directors, it would look like an accident. They even discussed how to handle the catering company, making sure the server was instructed to stay silent. The corporate machine was moving fast, attempting to grind the truth into dust before sunrise. Guest movement. I almost admired the speed of it, not the cruelty but the discipline. A camera technician was called over next. Richard never used the word delete. Men like him rarely use the words that can bury them later. He only asked which angles were purely internal and whether any clips had been synced outside the event archive. That told me enough. At 17 minutes past 10 in the evening, David called. "Movement?" he asked. "Yes," I said, watching Richard scan the room like a man checking whether the floor beneath him still looked solid. "They are relabeling. The records are being altered." "Stay quiet," David said. "Let them finish building the record. The more they alter, the clearer the breach becomes. The legal hold was officially served 10 minutes ago, so any deletion now is spoliation of evidence. Under federal law, once a party has reasonable anticipation of litigation, they have a strict duty to preserve all relevant evidence. Intentionally destroying, deleting, or altering records, known as spoliation of evidence, can lead to severe court sanctions and creates a rebuttable presumption that the evidence was unfavorable to them. Richard was digging a deeper hole with every file he tried to delete. I watched the camera technician nod and walk toward the control room. I knew that David's team was already capturing the server metadata in real time, documenting every single edit they made. So, I did. I left the hotel just before 11 o'clock, changed my blouse, and opened my laptop in silence. At 12 minutes past 11, an internal memo began circulating inside the Apex power grid. I never saw the document itself, but I learned what mattered from my internal sources. They were already trying to declare the night harmless enough for the money to move in the morning. At 31 minutes past 11, another message followed, containing a timeline scrubbed clean of intent. Then, at 43 minutes past 11, in the evening, a message appeared on my screen from Evelyn Brooks, Apex Power's chief financial officer. Just one line. "They are trying to turn an expulsion into housekeeping." It was a warning from the inside. Evelyn Brooks had been with Apex Power for over a decade. She knew the numbers, but more importantly, she knew the legal risks. She was the one who had spent the last 2 months reviewing our investment terms, and she knew that Mercer Capital's closing conditions included strict clauses about corporate integrity and executive conduct. She was not about to let Richard Thorne ruin a $2,400,000,000 partnership over his wife's arrogance. Her text was a clear signal that she was ready to stand for the truth, even if it meant defying the chief executive officer. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the boardroom had been reset so completely it almost looked innocent. Binders were aligned at every seat. Water glasses were filled. The wall screen displayed the release structure for the $2,400,000,000 capital commitment in clean stages and blue highlighted milestones. as if money moved through the world untouched by the character of the people asking for it. The primary tranche was highlighted in blue. That was the money scheduled to move that morning. Richard entered 3 minutes later with the expression of a man who had rehearsed calm in a mirror. Darker tie, steadier face, controlled posture. Nothing about him suggested that less than 12 hours earlier, his wife had tried to have me removed from a strategic room. Catherine was not there. That absence was deliberate. It offered the room a convenient fiction that whatever had happened had already been handled somewhere off stage by responsible people. A director near the end of the table murmured, "We are too close to closing to create drag now." Another answered, "Agreed." That was the mood Richard was counting on. Not confidence, but momentum, the kind executives mistake for protection when they know the facts are against them. Across from me, Evelyn Brooks had her binder open but had not turned the page. Beside her, Howard Finch, the lead independent director, sat with both hands folded loosely in front of him, unreadable. Neither spoke. Neither needed to explain their silence. The cameras in the boardroom were already on. Red lights glowed above the far wall. Richard took his seat at the head of the table. He cleared his throat, adjusted his papers, and looked around the room with a practiced air of authority. He was ready to push the transaction through, confident that the sheer volume of the capital would silence any lingering discomfort from the night before. He did know that the record he had spent the night altering was about to become his corporate headstone. Richard began in the smooth voice of a man trying to step over a crack without looking down. "Before we proceed," he said, glancing once around the room, "I want to note that last night involved a minor social misunderstanding." He looked directly into the camera, nothing more. The room did not react all at once. It tightened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to make the air feel thinner. Richard kept going. It was an unfortunate moment at a private receptions, an optics issue, not a conduct issue. It should not be allowed to interfere with a strategic funding process. Optics. Across from me, Evelyn lowered her gaze to the memo inside her binder. She did not touch it, but I could see the page from where I sat. It was the cleaned language, the softened version, the one they had wanted accepted before morning. Howard Finch spoke without raising his voice. "Who authorized the attempted removal of an invited strategic principal from that room?" Richard turned toward him, his smile remaining perfectly in place. "There was no attempted removal." Evelyn inhaled barely. "There was an instruction to relocate." Richard cut across her so quickly it almost sounded practiced. "A hospitality adjustment, nothing more. There it is." Not just the denial, but the specific wording. Howard's eyes moved once from Richard to Evelyn and back again. "Then why," he asked, "did the internal wording change after midnight?" For 1 second, nobody answered. A board member on my left opened his binder and flipped 3 pages in. Paper moved softly over polished wood. Another voice, lower this time, spoke up. There were client witnesses. The client witnesses had already begun sending emails to our investor relations team. One of the major clients had expressed deep concern that a key meeting could be disrupted in such a hostile manner, questioning whether Apex Power had the stability to handle a capital injection of this scale. Howard Finch knew this because the emails had been copied to the audit committee. He looked at Richard with a cold, piercing gaze, waiting for the chief executive officer to realize that his attempts to hide the truth had already failed. The boardroom was no longer a place of rubber stamps. It had become a court of inquiry. Richard's composure thinned. "We are not going to derail a $2,400,000,000 closing over a social incident," he said. "That would be absurd." That was the sentence that changed everything. Now the cover-up was no longer living in hallway conversations and midnight memos. It was happening live, on camera, in front of the board. Richard was trying to bury the truth by calling it smaller than it was, using his position to override the facts. A director near the wall screen turned to the covenant section. "Conduct language applies where reputational impact intersects with closing conditions," he read quietly. No one objected. No one stepped in to rescue Richard from the corner he was painting himself into. Howard Finch folded his hands again. "One question," he said. Richard looked at him. "Go ahead." Howard turned toward me. "Who controls the final release of the primary tranche?" Richard followed his gaze and stared at me, like a man realizing far too late that he had never bothered to learn the name of the woman his wife had tried to throw out of the room. No one spoke for a moment. That was the only honest reaction left in the room. I folded my hands on the table and answered Howard without drama. I do. Richard blinked once. I am sorry? I control the final release of the primary tranche, I said. I am the managing partner of Mercer Capital, and I am the sole signatory authorized to release that portion of the $2,400,000,000 capital commitment. The recalculation in the room was immediate, not emotional, but mathematical. Evelyn closed her binder. A board member halfway down the table stopped writing. Another leaned back in his chair as if distance might somehow make the sentence less real. To Richard's credit, he recovered fast. His face settled. His hands came together lightly on the table. In under 3 seconds, he shifted from denial to negotiation. Then let us be careful, he said, his voice smooth again. We should not allow a personal incident to jeopardize infrastructure at this scale. Personal, that was his next mistake, not the coffee, not the attempted removal, not the rewritten record, not the denial on camera. A personal incident. I held his gaze. Why, I asked. Should I trust a company that permits public humiliation, tries to rename it overnight, and then denies it on record the next morning? If this is how you manage a minor incident, how do you manage a crisis? He had no answer. The board members watched him, waiting for a response that would save the deal, but his silence was absolute. The independent directors began whispering among themselves, their faces grim. Richard's hands were flat on the table now, his knuckles turning white. He tried to lock eyes with the lead director, hoping for a lifeline, but Howard Finch was looking down at the corporate governance guidelines. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the low hum of the video recorder. In that silence, the power that Richard had wielded so confidently just minutes before began to evaporate, leaving him exposed and completely defenseless before the board. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he realized the leverage had completely shifted. You are escalating optics into governance risk. No, I said. Your company turned cruelty into governance risk the moment it chose the lie over the truth. The room stayed still. No one moved to protect him now. That was new. I gave him one final opening. I am not asking for theater, I said. I am asking for accountability. Why should I believe this behavior stops once the money is deployed and the doors are closed? Richard leaned back, composure returning by force. Because this company will not be held hostage by optics, he said. There it was again. Not conduct, not accountability, not leadership. Optics. I looked at him for 1 second longer, then reached for my phone. Several eyes tracked the movement immediately. Evelyn did not. She already knew. I set the phone carefully on the polished wood. This, I said. Stop being optics the moment your leadership lied on record. I picked up the phone and called David on speaker. No one tried to stop me. That mattered too. He answered on the first ring. Reynolds. This is Sarah Vance, I said, though by then no one in the room needed the introduction. Activate the conduct breach review under the closing covenant. We are issuing an immediate suspension of the primary tranche release pending a full governance review. The room went so quiet I could hear someone set down a pen. David's voice stayed even. Confirm the legal basis. The basis is a clear breach of fiduciary duty under United States corporate law, I explained, my voice carrying clearly across the table. Under corporate law, specifically the duty of loyalty and the duty of care, executive officers are strictly prohibited from acting in bad faith, concealing material facts from the board of directors, or using corporate systems to cover up personal misconduct. The chief executive officer witnessed the harassment, permitted it, and then active steps were taken to alter the official event logs and security records overnight to protect his family. This was followed by a false testimony given on record during this board session. This is a direct breach of fiduciary duty by the executive leadership, which constitutes a material governance failure under Section 4 of our closing covenants. Confirmed, David replied. The formal notice of suspension is being transmitted now. I ended the call. For 1 second, the room stayed suspended with it. Then Evelyn's secure inbox chimed. She looked down, did not touch the screen at first, then she opened it. Her face changed before she spoke. The release chain is frozen, she said quietly. Richard leaned forward, frozen as not withdrawn. No one answered him. Another message came through less than a minute later. This one hit multiple inboxes at once. It was the formal notice. Capital commitment suspended from closing effective immediately pending governance review. The full $2,400,000,000 was no longer accessible to Apex Power. Stopped, not delayed, not softened, stopped. A client liaison near the wall screen checked her phone and went pale. 3 strategic clients are pausing alignment, she said. They want leadership clarity before proceeding. Richard's chair scraped lightly against the floor. This is a pressure tactic, he said. A reputational overreaction. But the room had already moved past him. Howard Finch glanced once at the recording light above the far wall, then back to the table. Preserve the full record, he said. We are now in governance session. That was the real reversal. Not anger, not humiliation answered with humiliation. Structure. Catherine had poured coffee on me to push me out of a room. She thought I had no right to enter. Richard had watched, allowed it, then tried to rename the event until it sounded small enough to survive. It had not survived. Howard looked directly at him. This stopped being a funding discussion, he said, the moment you chose the record over the truth. The board did not remove Richard with shouting. Instead, they did it with language. By early afternoon, the motion was formalized. Administrative leave, pending a full governance review. No slammed doors, no dramatic security scene, just the precise removal of authority. The second consequence came an hour later. Catherine Thorne was stripped of every outward-facing role she held through proximity, influence, or vanity. She was removed from the foundation board, barred from client-facing events, and excluded from future strategic receptions. Before she could enter the afternoon follow-up session, she was quietly stopped at the door by security guards and told her access had been revoked. The same kind of access control she had tried to use on me. By then, the structural damage had already spread. The capital commitment remained suspended. Lenders paused next steps. Client alignment stalled, and analysts began using the phrase governance exposure. The third consequence came on record before the session adjourned. Howard Finch looked around the table and said, "For the avoidance of doubt, this was not an isolated social incident. It was a leadership failure identified before capital deployment." No one challenged him. Not Richard, not the board. I did not feel triumphant. People like Catherine always think the punishment is public embarrassment. It is not. The real punishment comes when the system finally stops pretending not to see them. I left the building in a fresh blouse and a clean jacket, moving through the lobby without hurry. Outside, the city looked exactly the same as it had the night before. By morning, they had not only lost $2,400,000,000, they had lost the right to decide who was small enough to dismiss.